Epic views, waterfall mists, summit sunsets. It's all better outside. And with All Trails, you can discover the best of nature with over 450,000 trails around the world. Download the free app today and find your next adventure.
With the Redfin app, you'll know the moment your next place hits the market. Whether you're looking to buy your dream home or rent a sweet apartment, give Redfin your gotta-have-it wish list of property features, and you'll receive real-time notifications tailored just for you. Ready to see it up close and personal? Scheduling a tour is just a tap away. Don't wait to find your perfect match. Download the Redfin app and start searching today. Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you still think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
Hi, I'm Christy Schreiber, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Schreiber, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. On December 10th, 1953, Clementine Churchill, together with her daughter Mary, were guests of King Gustav VI of Sweden as he presented to Clementine the Nobel Prize for Literature, which she received on behalf of her husband Winston Churchill. He, at the time, was with President Eisenhower at the Bermuda Conference. At the banquet, Lady Churchill read these remarks from her husband. The roll on which my name has been inscribed represents much that is outstanding in the world's literature. The judgment of the Swedish Academy is accepted as impartial, authoritative, and sincere throughout the civilized world. I am awestruck at your decision to include me. I do hope you are right. I feel we are both running a considerable risk and that I do not deserve it, but I shall have no misgivings if you have none. The committee went on to state that the award was given to him for his mastery of historical and biographical description as well as for his brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. So, when we think of Winston Churchill, most of us think of him as prime minister, which he was, of course. We think of him marching through the streets of London, holding up the symbolic V for victory with his hand, rallying the British to fight against the Nazis and to endure the harshest of bombings. We think of him standing next to Roosevelt, brokering a deal to end World War II. We think of him alone in the 1930s, the only one railing about the anti-Semitism, the military buildup, and the totalitarianism of Hitler. Historian A.J.P. Taylor described him as the savior of his country. During his life, he was a soldier, a journalist, biographer, historian, painter, orator, and politician. Isaiah Berlin described him as a gigantic figure, superhumanly bold, strong, and imaginative, the large human being of our time. He was a myth even before he died. He was called the essential hero. Of course, that's how Churchill thought of himself as well, and in fact was disappointed that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature and didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. However, as time has passed, history has developed a more human perspective on the life of this fascinating man. Not every decision was a good one. In fact, some of them were brutally wrong. He was certainly a Victorian and an imperialist, but even taking all of these things into account, there is little dispute among historians that if it weren't for Winston Churchill, swastikas would likely be on most buildings in Western Europe. Winston Churchill stood in the way of Adolf Hitler, and even though he certainly made important key decisions that certainly aided the war effort, it could be argued that it was the power of his rhetoric, both in speeches, on the radio, And in his letters to the Allies, that was the power that propelled the Allies to victory against Nazism. This episode and next, we will discuss Winston Churchill, the man, and feature two of his most famous speeches. This episode, we will feature the speech, "We Shall Fight," and its significance in the Allied victory in World War II. Next episode, we will look more at his life more in general and read his famous Iron Curtain address given in Fulton, Missouri.
You know, it's hard for me to imagine how Churchill even found time to write as much as he did. I mean, his body of work is enormous, and I didn't realize this before, but it was actually his primary source of income during most of his life. It's estimated that his entire published corpus contains over 36,917 pages. He wrote everything from letters to speeches to history books to memoirs, even a novel, although most say it wasn't all that awesome. He was a thoughtful writer. He was highly concerned with style, and he developed very specific opinions about what constituted good writing really early on in his life, despite the fact that he never attended any of England's, famous prestigious universities. As a young man in 1897, he wrote an essay titled "The Scaffolding of Rhetoric." And in this essay, he presented his philosophy on how to develop an effective style and what the strategies that you would need to use. And we see these strategies in most of the pieces that are famous today. And he talked about how he was going to do it even in this early piece of writing. He believed in specific things: precise diction, meter and rhythm, the use of analogies, and the construction of a rhetorical climax. He loved using quotes and proverbs, and he did so to establish credibility, but also to help him create these incredible emotional appeals that he's so famous for. In fact, one historian performed a statistical analysis just on the use of quotable phrases and discovered that he used on average a quote, as in quoting somebody else, or a proverb. He used one basically for every 11 pages of writing. When it came to his war rhetoric, though, perhaps no one said it better than John F. Kennedy when he said this about Winston Churchill. He said, "In the dark days and darker nights, when England stood alone and most men, save Englishmen, despaired of England's life, he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle." And so, taking our cue from JFK, let's look at what is considered to be Winston Churchill's most memorable speech, "We Shall Fight," and just see why it was so important and how it mobilized and possibly even saved a nation and the free world as we understand it today. So let's set the stage, because for most of us, the context is slightly confusing. Gary, Winston Churchill's most famous speech, "We Shall Fight," was given on June 4, 1940. He'd only been prime minister for 25 days. What was going on?
Correct. And only a few weeks prior, on May 13th, he had given his first speech as prime minister 3 days after Hitler had invaded France, Belgium, and Holland. And in that first speech, he outlined the challenge ahead of the British people. He famously said, "I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many months of struggle and suffering."
That, by the way, is a famous phrase a lot of people associate with Churchill. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. There's a lot of rhyme, assonance, alliteration, and imagery in that little expression. It's very memorable.
Well, memorable as it may be, it was not an exaggeration. I mean, things were bleak. If we remember, the Germans had invaded Poland in September of 1939. After that, there was what some have called the phony war, because all of the Allies had declared war on Germany. There was no real fighting at that point. However, in April of 1940, the Nazis changed that. They attacked Norway. The Allies were unable to defend Norway, and it fell to the Nazis. The Prime Minister of England at that time was Neville Chamberlain, and he was held responsible for this. His government collapsed, and Winston Churchill, who really hadn't been that popular up to that point, was appointed England's new prime minister, in large part because he had been the prophet howling in the wilderness for the last decade against the excesses of the Nazis and the British position of appeasement, and he was being proven right. The Germans, however, were powerful. They had devised a war strategy called the Blitzkrieg, which was lightning war. It was fast, it was surprising, it was powerful. The German Blitzkrieg into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands began on the very day that Churchill took office. They did not attack the same way they had in World War I, and it took the Allies by surprise, and they plowed through the Ardennes forest like it was nothing, a forest the French thought they couldn't even get their tanks through. By May 14, they had crossed the Meuse River and were headed to the English Channel. Now, the reason this is so bad is that the British had sent almost their entire army into this location. The BEF, or the British Expeditionary Force, had over 390,000 troops in the area. It was almost the entire British army, and it was trapped between the Germans and the English Channel. Now, initially, the Allies had more tanks and men, but the German panzers were much more technologically superior. The German troops had better equipment, better tactics, and the Germans had a significant air power advantage. The Germans were going to finish off the Allies, and in fact, as we look back at history, they almost did. The Allies had to retreat, and there was nowhere to go. They were stuck between the Germans and the water, and I'll let Churchill tell his version of events, but just so you know how this ends, there are a lot of details, but what happens is really, truly a miracle. The weather plays into the Allies' favor in the most miraculous way possible, and the Germans just stopped advancing. Hitler inexplicably tells the generals to stop marching and pauses the offensive for 3 days. And during this time, the British miraculously are able to evacuate the entire army to position themselves strategically and allow for an escape. Later in his memoirs, Hitler claims that he was wanting to give Churchill a fighting chance. You know, that claim seems ludicrous. I mean, there have been other theories as to what caused Hitler to stop the assault for those 3 days. But in the end, nearly 340,000 men escaped in what was called Operation Dynamo. It was termed the Dunkirk miracle. The most optimistic estimates were that they would be able to save maybe 30,000 men. And remember, these were people's sons and fathers. But because of the heroism of many, the ingenuity of the British Navy, and even the cooperation of fishing boats that helped, Britain and the Allies had survived to fight another day. And this is the occasion for the speech that we're going to look at.
Well, and it is an occasion. Churchill does not give the speech on the radio. In fact, it wasn't even recorded. He does record it after the war later for posterity, so you may have heard the recording or at least a clip, but it wasn't the recording wasn't the speech that he gave on that day. The immediate audience was the House of Commons. That's where he gave the speech. It was, however, repeated on paper in the news, and the world was interested. What would Churchill say? Churchill knew this, and he had 3 audiences in mind when he spoke. First, he wanted to speak directly to the British people. He needed to reassure them about the British military capabilities, but also he really needed to tap down the exuberance over the evacuation. He will actually say, evacuations don't win wars. But he wasn't just talking to the British. He was also talking to the Germans. He wants Germany to know that he is not backing down. The British people will fight until there is not a single man left. He views, and the British would view this as a battle between good and evil, and they were not compromising with evil. But thirdly, and maybe this is something that a lot of people don't think about, he also was speaking directly to the United States of America. He wanted and needed America's assistance. Churchill thought that World War II would be a world war, and he was right. At that point, people thought of it as a European dispute, and America wanted nothing to do with it.
I also want to point out that Churchill was also one of the first to recognize that it would be America that would win the war if it was to be won. He likely knew, even at this early date, that allies could not beat Germany without the United States. And they were, in fact, just hanging on until someone could convince Roosevelt and the American people to intervene. Of course, he could thank the Japanese for their part in doing that, but he certainly did his part. And he would portray the Allies over and over again as representing Western civilization, Western morality, Western values, and as the Germans as monsters and barbaric and subhuman. He wanted the U.S. to know that France might fall. Belgium had already surrendered, but Britain would never surrender to Hitler, ever.
And so, with that by way of introduction, let's begin reading the speech. I want to point out that he will follow the classical outline. We refer to this Greek classical outline many, many times. Most authors use it. An introduction, the background, the body. He'll have a refutation, and of course, his famous conclusion. But the introduction is unusual. He will drop the reader, or the listener really, into the middle of the battle. The descriptions of the battle are vivid. He's writing for a general audience, so he's not talking politically or academically. He wanted to waken our imagination to that moment where the Germans cross the Meuse River. They break the Allied defenses. And so, let's begin.
First of all, I would like to give a disclaimer.
Uh-oh.
I am really going to apologize for not having a Winston Churchill voice to read his speech.
I know. Or an accent, the right accent.
Correct. Maybe AI could fix that for us. I'll do the best I can with my Midwestern twang.
Oh, dear. Well, his mother was American, so.
There you go. From the moment that the French defenses at Sedan and on the Meuse were broken at the end of the second week of May, only a rapid retreat to the Amiens in the south could have saved the British and French armies who had entered Belgium at the appeal of the Belgian king. But this strategic fact was not immediately realized. The French high command hoped they would be able to close the gap, and the armies of the north were under their orders. Moreover, a retirement of this kind would have involved almost certainly the destruction of the fine Belgian army of over 20 divisions and the abandonment of the whole of Belgium. Therefore, when the force and the scope of the German penetration were realized, and when a new French generalissimo, General Weygand, assumed command in place of General Gamelin, an effort was made by the French and the British armies in Belgium to keep on holding the right hand of the Belgians and to give their own right hand to the newly created French army, which was to have advanced across the Somme in great strength to grasp it. However, the German eruption swept like a sharp sigh around the right and rear of the armies of the north. 8 or 9 armored divisions, each of about 400 armored vehicles of different kinds, but carefully assorted to be complementary and divisible into small self-contained units, cut off all communications between us and the main French armies. It severed our own communications for food and ammunition, which ran first to Amiens and later on through Abbeville and shore its way up the coast to Boulogne and Calais and almost to Dunkirk. Behind this armored and mechanized onslaught came a number of German divisions and lorries, and behind them again there plodded comparatively slowly the dull brute mass of the ordinary German army and German people, always so ready to be led to the trampling down in other lands of liberties and comforts which they have never known on their own. I have said this armored size stroke almost reached Dunkirk, almost, but not quite. Boulogne and Calais were the scenes of desperate fighting. The Guards defended Boulogne for a while and were there withdrawn by orders from this country. The Rifle Brigade, the 60th Rifles, and the Queen Victoria's Rifles with a battalion of British tanks and 1,000 Frenchmen, in all about 4,000 strong, defended Calais to the last. The British brigadier was given an hour to surrender. He spurned the offer, and 4 days of intense street fighting passed before silence reigned over Calais, which marked the end of a memorable resistance. Only 30 unwounded survivors were brought off by the Navy, and we do not know the fate of their comrades. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain. At least 2 armored divisions, which otherwise would have been turned against the British Expeditionary Force, had to be sent to overcome them. They have added another page to the glories of the light divisions, and the time gained enabled the Gravelines water lines to be flooded and to be held by the French troops. Thus, it was that the port of Dunkirk was kept open. When it was found impossible for the armies of the North to reopen their communications to Amiens with the main French armies, only one choice remained. It seemed, indeed, forlorn. The British, the Belgian, and the French armies were almost surrounded. Their sole line of retreat was to a single port and to its neighboring beaches. They were pressed on every side by heavy attacks and far outnumbered in the air.
Well, you can see he basically just described a terrible retreat. And notice the language. The German eruption swept like a sharp sieve. I mean, he's mixing metaphors, which most of the time people don't like, but he's making a valid point. The Germans are coming out of this forest, and it was like a volcano exploding. It was like a sharp sieve. I mean, that's that tool used for cutting crops like wheat. So in other words, we were just getting cut down like we were grass. Except he says we were cut down, but not quite. We held out at Calais. You know, Calais is a small town on the coast, and they were able to hold off the Germans. His claim is that this effort of keeping Calais was enough just to buy enough time, that extra time, to get all the men to Dunkirk, which was the only port where they could escape.
I want to point out that Churchill throws King Leopold of Belgium under the bus here, to use an expression that may be slightly inappropriate in this situation.
Under the tank.
Right. But he will again later in the speech. King Leopold is one of only a few people mentioned by name in the whole speech, and we will see that Churchill is not happy with him. In fact, he's angry at him. He's going to claim that the English and the French stayed. They lost lives to defend him, and he almost immediately surrendered to Hitler at the first opportunity. This was a huge betrayal to the Allies.
Well, let me read the next part of the speech. When a week ago I asked the House to fix this afternoon as the occasion for a statement, I feared it would be my hard lot to announce the greatest military disaster in our long history. I thought, and some good judges agreed with me, that perhaps 20,000 or 30,000 men might be re-embarked, but it certainly seemed that the whole of the French First Army and the whole of the British expeditionary force north of the Amiens Abbeville Gap would be broken up in the open field, or else they would have to capitulate for lack of food and ammunition. These were the hard and heavy tidings for which I called upon the House and the nation to prepare themselves a week ago. The whole root and core and brain of the British Army, on which and around which we were to build and are to build the great British armies in the later years of the war, seemed about to perish upon the field or to be led into an ignominious and starving captivity. That was the prospect a week ago. But another blow, which might well have proved final, was yet to fall upon us. The great king of the Belgians had called upon us to come to his aid. Had not this ruler and his government severed themselves from the Allies, who rescued their country from extinction in the late war, and had they not sought refuge in what was proved to be a fatal neutrality, the French and the British armies might well at the outset have saved not only Belgium, but perhaps even Poland. Yet at the last moment, when Belgium was already invaded, King Leopold called upon us to come to his aid, and even at the last moment, we came. He and his brave, efficient army, nearly 500,000 strong, guarded our left flank and thus kept our only line of retreat to the sea. Suddenly, without prior consultation, with the least possible notice, without the advice of his ministers, and upon his own personal act, he sent a plenipotentiary to the German command, surrendered his army, and exposed our whole flank and means of retreat. I asked the House a week ago to suspend its judgment because the facts were not clear, but I do not feel that any reason now exists why we should not form our own opinion upon this pitiful episode. The surrender of the Belgian army compelled the British at the shortest notice to cover a flank to the sea more than 30 miles in length. Otherwise, all would have been cut off, and all would have been shared the fate to which King Leopold had condemned the finest army his country had ever formed. So in doing this and exposing this flank, as anyone who followed the operation on the map will see, contact was lost between the British and 2 out of the 3 corps forming the First French Army, who were still farther from the coast than we were. And it seemed impossible that any large number of Allied troops could reach the coast. I can tell that Winston Churchill is not happy with King Leopold. I mean, he views what Leopold did was treacherous and backstabbing, not just to the French or the British, but also to his own countrymen. Gary, let's read the next section as he further describes the bleak situation that King Leopold had left the French and the British in.
The enemy attacked on all sides with great strength and fierceness, and their main power, the power of their far more numerous air force, was thrown into the battle or else concentrated upon Dunkirk and the beaches. Pressing in upon the narrow exit, both from the east and from the west, the enemy began to fire with cannon upon the beaches by which alone the shipping could approach or depart. They sowed magnetic mines into channels and seas. They sent repeated waves of hostile aircraft, sometimes more than 100 strong in one formation, to cast their bombs upon the single pier that remained and upon the sand dunes upon which the troops had their eyes for shelter. Their U-boats, one of which was sunk, and their motor launches took their toll off the vast traffic of which now began. For 4 or 5 days an intense struggle reigned. All their armored divisions, or what was left of them together, with great masses of infantry and artillery, hurled themselves in vain upon the ever-narrowing, ever-contracting appendix within which the British and the French armies fought. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, with the willing help of countless merchant seamen, strained every nerve to embark the British and Allied troops. 220 light warships and 650 other vessels were engaged. They had to operate upon the difficult coast, often in adverse weather, under an almost ceaseless hail of bombs and an increasing concentration of artillery fire. Nor were the seas, as I have said, themselves free from mines and torpedoes. It was in conditions such as these that our men carried on, with little or no rest, for days and nights on end, making trip after trip across the dangerous waters, bringing with them always men whom they had rescued. The numbers they had brought back are the measure of their devotion and their courage. The hospital ships, which brought off many thousands of British and French wounded, being so plainly marked, were a special target for Nazi bombs. But the men and the women on board them never faltered in their duty. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force, which had already been intervening in the battle so far as its range would allow from home bases, now used part of its main metropolitan fighter strength and struck at the German bombers and at the fighters which in large numbers protected them. This struggle was protracted and fierce. Suddenly the scene has cleared. The crash and the thunder has for the moment, but only for the moment, died away. A miracle of deliverance achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity is manifest to us all. The enemy was hurled back by the retreating British and French troops. He was so roughly handled that he did not hurry their departure seriously. The Royal Air Force engaged the main strength of the German Air Force and inflicted upon them losses of at least 4-1, and the Navy, using nearly 1,000 ships of all kinds, carried over 335,000 men, French and British, out of the jaws of death and shame to their native land and to the tasks which lie immediately ahead. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance, which should be noted. It was gained by the Air Force. Many of our soldiers coming back have not seen the Air Force at work. They saw only the bombers which escaped its protective attack. They underrated its achievements. I've heard much talk of this. This is why I go out of my way to say this. I will tell you about it.
So Churchill does not downplay the might of the Germans. In fact, he portrays them as unbeatable, except, we got away, by sheer heroism. And he emphasizes the work of the Air Force, the Army, and even private citizens who grabbed their little personal boat and went over there and helped rescue the trapped soldiers get back to England. He also uses this phrase, miracle of deliverance. He uses the word deliverance over and over again. For Churchill, this is not just a military conflict. I mean, he sees what's going on as a cosmic battle between good versus evil. And God is taking care of us. It's a miracle, just as God delivered the Israelites from the Egyptians by allowing them to cross a body of water on dry land. God has brought his people home by all these different means necessary back across this body of water. I mean, the language really does have a biblical flavor to it. The next section of the speech is the body of the speech. So all of this is background. This is the context. This is where this is what he's saying. This is how we got to where we are now. But he's essentially going to say that Dunkirk was this great trial between the British and the Germans. And they are now the new knights of the round tables. The British are the defenders of civilization. They're outnumbered for sure. But all of this to say, the British will not lose. Britain can and will be defended from the Nazis. That's the main claim of the speech that you're going to see him argue from this point forward.
This was a great trial of strength between the British and German air forces. Can you conceive a greater objective for the Germans in the air than to make evacuation from these beaches impossible and to sink all these ships, which were displayed almost to the extent of thousands? Could there have been an objective of greater military importance and significance for the whole purpose of this war than this? They tried hard, and they were beaten back. They were frustrated in their task. We got the army away, and they have paid fourfold for any losses which they have inflicted. Very large formations of German aeroplanes, and we know that they are a very brave race, have turned on several occasions from the attack of 1/4 of their number of the Royal Air Force and have dispersed in different directions. 12 airplanes have been hunted by 2. One airplane was driven into the water and cast away by the mere charge of a British airplane, which had no more ammunition. All of our types, the Hurricane, the Spitfire, and the new Defiant, and all our pilots have been vindicated as superior to what they have at present to face. When we consider how much greater would be our advantage in defending the air above this island against any overseas attack, I must say that I find in these facts a sure basis upon which practical and reassuring thoughts may rest. I will pay my tribute to these young airmen. The great French army was very largely for the first time being cast back and disturbed by the onrush of a few thousands of armored vehicles. May it not also be that the cause of civilization itself will be defended by the skill and devotion of a few thousand airmen? There never has been, I suppose, in all the world, in all the history of war, such an opportunity for youth. The Knights of the Round Table, the Crusaders, all fall back into the past, not only distant but prosaic. These young men going forth every morn to guard their native land and all that we stand for, holding in their hands these instruments of colossal and shattering power, of whom it may be said that every morn brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble knight. They deserve our gratitude, as do all the brave men who, in so many ways and on so many occasions, are ready and continue ready to give life in all for their native land. I return to the army. In a long series of very fierce battles, now on this front, now on that, fighting on 3 fronts at once, battles fought by 2 or 3 divisions against an equal or somewhat larger number of the enemy, and fought fiercely on some of the old grounds that so many of us know so well. In these battles, our losses in men have exceeded 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing. I take occasion to express the sympathy of the House to all who have suffered bereavement or who are still anxious. The president of the Board of Trade, Sir Andrew Duncan, is not here today. His son has been killed, and many in the House have felt the pangs of affliction in the sharpest form. But I will say this about the missing. We have had a large number of wounded come home safely to this country, but I would say about the missing that there may be very many reported missing who will come back home someday in one way or another. In the confusion of this fight, it is inevitable that many have been left in positions where honor required no further resistance from them. Against this loss of over 30,000 men, we can set a far heavier loss certainly inflicted upon the enemy. But our losses in materiel are enormous. We have perhaps lost 1/3 of the men we lost in the opening days of the Battle of 21st March, 1918, but we have lost nearly as many guns, nearly 1,000 in all our transport, all the armored vehicles that were with the Army in the North. This loss will impose a further delay on the expansion of our military strength. That expansion had not been proceeding as far as we had hoped. The best of all we had to give had gone to the British Expeditionary Force, and although they had not the numbers of tanks and some articles of equipment which were desirable, they were a very well and finely equipped army. They had the first fruits of all of our industry had to give, and that is gone. And now here is this further delay. How long will it be? How long will it last? It depends upon the exertions which we make in this island. An effort the like of which has never been seen in our records is now being made. Work is proceeding everywhere, night and day, Sundays and weekdays. Capital and labor have cast aside their interests, rights, and customs and put them into the common stock. Already the flow of munitions has leaped forward. There is no reason why we should not in a few months overtake the sudden and serious loss that has come upon us without retarding the development of our general program.
And so we can hear Churchill's confidence. And we have taken a hit, but we will unite capital and labor, everyone working together. We can do this. You know, the next section of the essay is what we call the refutation. He concedes some things. He's going to say, I know this is true. He's going to concede that they had suffered what he will call a colossal military disaster. I mean, he's not even going to pretend that Britain is ready to be invaded. But even though the situation is dire, the British government is doing something to deal with it. And that's his response. I know things are bad, but we're working on it. We will not be content with a defensive war, he's going to say. We will attack back. He's also going to address the fact that there are Nazi sympathizers in Britain. He uses a term that we don't use anymore. He says he's going to talk about the fifth column. The fifth column is a group of people inside a government who try to undermine the government they theoretically work for. And he's going after those people. Let's read the refutation, and then I'll read the closing lines that have made this speech so famous. It's the closing lines, the closing paragraph really, has been called one of the most famous paragraphs in the English language.
Nevertheless, our thankfulness at the escape of our army and so many men whose loved ones have passed through an agonizing week must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster. The French army has been weakened. The Belgian army has been lost. A large part of those fortified lines upon which so much faith had been reposed is gone. Many valuable mining districts and factories have passed into the enemy's possession. The whole of the Channel ports are in his hands with all the tragic consequences that follow from that. And we must expect another blow to be struck almost immediately at us or at France. We are told that Herr Hitler has a plan for invading the British Isles. This has often been thought of before. When Napoleon lay at Boulogne for a year with his flat-bottomed boats and his grand army, he was told by someone, "There are bitter weeds in England. There are certainly a great many more of them since the British Expeditionary Force returned." The whole question of home defense against invasion is, of course, powerfully affected by the fact that we have, for the time being, in this island, incomparably more powerful military forces than we've ever had at any moment in this war or the last. But this will not continue. We shall not be content with the defensive war. We have our duty to our ally. We have to reconstitute and build up the British Expeditionary Force once again under its gallant commander-in-chief, Lord Gort. All this is in train. But in the interval, we must put our defenses in this island into such a high state of organization that the fewest possible numbers will be required to give effective security, and that the largest possible potential of offensive effort may be realized. On this, we are now engaged. It will be very convenient, if it be the desire of the House, to enter upon this subject in a secret session. Not that the government would necessarily be able to reveal in very great detail military secrets, but we like to have our discussions free. without the restraint imposed by the fact that they will be read the next day by the enemy. And the government would benefit by views freely expressed in all parts of the House of the members with their knowledge of so many different parts of the country. I understand that some request is to be made upon the subject which will be readily acceded to by His Majesty's government. We have found it necessary to take measures of increasing stringency, not only against enemy aliens and suspicious characters of other nationalities, but also against British subjects who may become a danger or a nuisance should the war be transported to the United Kingdom. I know there are a great many people affected by the orders which we have made who are passionate enemies of Nazi Germany. I am very sorry for them, but we cannot, at the present time, under the present stress, draw all the distinctions which we should like to do. If parachute landings were attempted and fierce fighting attendant upon them followed, these unfortunate people would be far better out of the way for their own sakes as well as for ours. There is, however, another class for which I feel not the slightest sympathy. Parliament has given us the powers to put down fifth-column activities with a strong hand, and we shall use those powers subject to the supervision and correction of the House without the slightest hesitation until we are satisfied, and more than satisfied, that this malignancy in our midst has been effectively stamped out. Turning once again, and this time more generally, to the question of invasion, I would observe that there has never been a period in all these long centuries of which we boast when an absolute guarantee against invasion, still less against serious raids, could have been given to our people. In the days of Napoleon, the same wind which would have carried his transports across the Channel might have driven away the blockading fleet. There was always the chance, and it is that chance which has excited and befooled the imaginations of many continental tyrants. Many are the tales that are told. We are assured that novel methods will be adopted, and when we see the originality of malice, the ingenuity of aggression, which our enemy displays, we may certainly prepare ourselves for every kind of novel stratagem and every kind of brutal and treacherous maneuver. I think that no idea is so outlandish that it should not be considered and viewed with a searching, but at the same time, I hope with a steady eye. We must never forget the solid assurances of sea power and those which belong to air power if it can be locally exercised.
And so now the finale. I have myself full confidence that if all their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen and may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a minute believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the Old.
Well, it's patriotic for sure, but it's not mythological. I mean, he admits Britain's weaknesses and need for the United States. He admits that France may indeed fall, and of course, we know that it did fall. And yet, he has encouraged them to stay in the fight. And this is more than a call to arms or fancy language. This is the blueprint for how they're going to go to the end. And each phrase represents a step by the Nazis. We shall fight in France, then the seas, then in the air, then on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets. I mean, no matter what it takes, he's envisioning a world where the Germans storm into Britain, totally overrunning it, and they are still in the game. And in some ways, it's a little depressing.
And yet it's not depressing, and it's in the plural. He's saying it's better for us to be totally destroyed than to lose our soul. And he truly believes that to be true.
And there were those who did not agree with him. One famous critic said this: Churchill's rhetoric was creating a climate in which, unless the final disaster overtook the nation, the expression of the contrary point of view looked not only treasonable, which was bad enough, but cowardly, which was worse.
Yes, and that's exactly what he meant to do. I mean, earlier that month, he'd said, nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. So Britain was not surrendering tamely, at least not under his watch. For Churchill, Britain was the example. Britain was the light shining in darkness. And at all costs, they were not going to voluntarily surrender. No compromise.
So when Churchill finished speaking, Parliament cheered.
Woohoo!
He had moved the House of Commons, and he was about to move the nation.
And in a sense, that's kind of ironic. I mean, a speech which in some ways envisions the total destruction of his country, and yet he inspires his people to self-sacrifice. I mean, the spirit of resistance. And it was indeed a spirit of unity.
And it's true. Churchill, like a good coach, was able to describe the situation as bad as it was, but yet truly help his people believe that they could win. He knew them for who they were and what they were capable of, and history has proven him to be right. So, on that victorious, patriotic note, thank you for listening today. Whether you are British, French, American, or from any other part of the world, I hope you are inspired by one of Britain's finest speakers, knowing that if we are grounded in moral sincerity, unified by a common trust, supported by a benevolent and sovereign God, truly the human spirit can overcome great and potentially insurmountable odds. It has before, and it will again. Our next episode, we continue our discussion of Winston Churchill in the context of post-World War II. We will also take a few minutes to look at his early years and his family life. And remember, you can always reach out to us through our website at howtolovelitpodcast.com, our social media, or through email. We always love to connect. Remember to share this episode or any episode with a friend, knowing that when you share, we grow. And as always, thank you for your support in helping us make great literature accessible and understandable and available to as many people as possible.
Peace out.
Location, the lab. Quentin only has 24 hours to sell his car. Is that even possible? He goes to Carvana.com.
What is this, a movie trailer?
He ignores the doubters, enters his license plate. Wow, that's a great offer. The car is sold, but will Carvana pick it up in time for...
They'll literally pick it up tomorrow morning. Done with the dramatics?
Car selling in record time.
Save your time. Go to Carvana.com and sell your car today. Pickup fees may apply.
Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you still think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard, based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. The urge doesn't shout, it whispers. When the world goes quiet, it starts talking again. Old patterns, old pull, same crossroads. That's when I reach for Fume. Not to numb, not to chase a high, just to breathe, to choose. Fume works because it gives your hands something to do, your mind something to focus on, and your body a calming rhythm to return to. No nicotine, no vapor, just the power to interrupt a craving without relying on willpower alone. This isn't about quitting. It's about replacing, rewriting, one breath at a time. Go to tryfume.com/Acast. That's tryfum.com/Acast to start your journey today. No smoke, no vapor, just the good habit.